There is a number that nobody in Las Vegas, Phoenix, or Los Angeles wants to talk about: 895 feet. That is the height where Lake Mead hits what engineers call dead pool, the point where water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam on its own. No power, no water moving. No supply for 25 million people across 7 states. In July of 2022, the lake dropped to around 1,040 feet. That is the lowest it has been since the lake was first filled in the 1930s. Closer to dead pool than at any point in its 90-year life. Now, it has come back a bit since then. Good snowpack in the Rockies pushed levels up. And if you only look at the surface, you might think the crisis is over. But the math under that rise has not changed. And the math is the part that should worry you. To understand what is really going on at Hoover Dam, you have to start with what the canyon looks like today. If you drive out from Las Vegas on Highway 93 and look down into Black Canyon, the first thing you notice is a white line. It runs along both walls of the canyon, from one end of Lake Mead to the other, a bathtub ring. Mineral stains left behind as the water pulled away, leaving a chalk-white scar across miles of dark canyon rock. That white ring rises taller than a 10-story building. You can see it from space photos. You can see it from the Las Vegas Strip on a clear day. It is likely the biggest mark left by a water crisis anywhere on Earth, and it has been growing for more than 20 years. At full pool, Lake Mead holds roughly 26 million acre-feet of water. 1 acre-foot is about 326,000 gallons, roughly enough to keep 2 average American homes running for a year. The full lake sits at a height of 1,221 feet above sea level. Today, even after 2 decent snow seasons, the lake sits around 1,070 to 1,080 feet. That is still roughly 140 feet below where it should be. Still barely more than a quarter full. A lake built to hold 9 years of Colorado River flow now holds closer to 2. And here is where the real digging begins. Because this is not a drought story. Drought means something that comes and goes, something that ends when the rain comes back. This is a math story, and the math has been wrong for over 100 years. In November of 1922, leaders from 7 states met at a lodge in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to sign what became known as the Colorado River Compact. The man running the talks was Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, years before he became president. Years before the dam that would carry his name was even built. The idea was simple. Split the river's water among the states that need it: Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. They looked at the flow records they had from the past few decades, and they split up 16.5 million acre-feet of water per year, 7.5 million to the upper states, 7.5 million to the lower states. Plus another 1.5 million later promised to Mexico by treaty. Sounds fair. Sounds like it makes sense, except for one huge problem that nobody at that table knew about. The flow data they were using came from an oddly wet stretch. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw some of the heaviest Colorado River flows in centuries. A rare cluster of high water years that made the river look far bigger and more steady than it really was. They built a whole legal system on what turned out to be a fluke. The Colorado River's real long-term average, tracked across more than 1,000 years of tree ring data studied by climate researchers at UCLA, is closer to 12 to 13 million acre-feet. Some years, it carries less than 10. The compact promised roughly 25 to 30% more water than the river has ever truly carried. And here is the part that really stings. Some scientists at the time knew the numbers looked too good. They raised worries that the river was being measured during an oddly generous stretch. But the push to get the deal done was too strong. 7 states had finally agreed on something, and nobody wanted to reopen the deal with smaller numbers. So they signed it, cheered it, and built a whole way of life on top of it. So from day one, 7 states were splitting up water that did not exist. And for decades, it did not matter, because Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the 2 biggest man-made lakes in the country, had enough stored water to cover the gap. Think of the lakes as a savings account. The states were spending more than the river brought in each year, but the account had been built up during those flush early years. There was a cushion. That cushion is now almost gone. And once a savings account hits zero, every shortfall shows up right away. But it gets worse, because the overpromise is only half the problem. The other half is a megadrought. That same UCLA research team found that the drought gripping the Colorado River Basin right now is the worst in at least 1,200 years. Not the driest single year on record, the driest long stretch, going back further than the founding of Oxford, further than the signing of the Magna Carta, further than the Norman attack on England. You have to go back to the 800s to find a dry spell this long and this harsh in the American Southwest. So, you have a river that was overpromised from the start, now running through the worst dry stretch in over 1,000 years. And 25 million people have built their cities, their water systems, their farms, and their whole way of life on top of it. And here is where the picture gets harder to read, because the last couple of years have actually brought decent snow. In the winter of 2022 to 2023, the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountain states saw heavy snowpack. The Colorado River Basin got a real boost. Lake Mead rose roughly 30 to 40 feet from its 2022 low. Headlines cheered the comeback. News anchors said the crisis might be easing. Social media posts showed water creeping back up the bathtub ring. But a 30-foot rise in a lake that is 140 feet low is not a comeback. It is a pause. The gap between what the 7 states are allowed to take and what the river actually carries is still somewhere around 3 to 4 million acre-feet per year. That means even in a good snow year, more water leaves the system than enters it. Think of it this way. You have a bank account that brings in $12,000 a year, but your bills total $16,000. One year, you get a $3,000 bonus. Feels great. Your balance goes up for a month, but you are still spending $4,000 more than you earn. You are still going broke, just a little slower. The Colorado River system has been running that gap for more than 2 decades, and every year, it grows. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover water crises, earth science events, and geography news as they happen, with the full picture you need to actually follow what is going on. Now let us talk about what is happening to Hoover Dam itself. Because the dam is not just a wall holding back water. It is one of the biggest power plants in the western United States. And power plants need pressure. When Hoover Dam was finished in 1935, 2 years ahead of schedule, it was the biggest concrete structure on Earth, 726 feet tall from base to top, 45 feet thick at the top and 660 feet thick at the base. Enough concrete to pave a 2-lane road from San Francisco to New York City. It took 5,000 workers going around the clock in shifts through summers where Black Canyon heat hit 120 degrees. 96 workers died during the build. The dam went up during the Great Depression, and men lined up by the thousands for a shot at a job site that could kill them. It was, and in many ways still is, a symbol of what Americans could build when they chose to reshape the land itself. The dam makes power through something called hydraulic head. That is the height gap between the surface of the lake and the spinning turbines at the base of the dam. Water falls through intake towers, drops hundreds of feet through giant pipes, and slams into turbines at the bottom. The higher the lake, the harder the water hits, the more power the turbines push out. At full pool, Hoover Dam can put out roughly 2,080 megawatts, enough power for about 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. For decades, that power was cheap and steady, a backbone of the Southwest power grid. But as Lake Mead dropped, so did the output. Every foot of lost lake height cuts the force driving the turbines. At the 2022 low, Hoover Dam's output had fallen by roughly 25 to 40%. The Bureau of Reclamation rushed to put in emergency low-water turbines, smaller units built to work with less pressure, just to keep the dam making any power at all. A dam built to be one of the most productive power plants in the country was running on backup gear. And power is only one piece of the problem. The original water intake pipes that feed Las Vegas were built for a lake that stays above 1,000 feet. As the water dropped toward that line, there was a real chance the intakes would start pulling in air instead of water. For a city of 2.2 million people, that gets roughly 90% of its drinking water from Lake Mead. That is not a planning problem. That is a survival problem. One person saw this coming years before anyone else took it seriously. Pat Mulroy ran the Southern Nevada Water Authority for over 2 decades, starting in 1989. She became something like the warning voice of the Colorado River. She read the climate studies, she watched the lake levels, and she warned year after year that Las Vegas was heading toward a cliff that nobody wanted to face. Her critics called her an alarmist. They said she was crying wolf to get funding. Instead of just sounding the alarm, she built a fix. It is called the third straw, a huge intake tunnel drilled deep under Lake Mead at a height of roughly 860 feet, well below the original intakes. The tunnel is 3 miles long, bored through solid rock beneath the lake bed. The project cost about $1.4 billion and took years to finish, wrapping up in 2015. At the time, people asked whether spending that kind of money was needed. By 2022, when the original intakes were nearing their limits and the lake was dropping toward record lows, the third straw was the only reason Las Vegas still had water coming out of the tap. But the third straw does not fix the river. It just lets Las Vegas drink from the bottom of a shrinking glass. And it only helps one city. The rest of the basin has no such backup. The human cost of the crisis has already landed in places with less money and less political pull than Las Vegas. In Pinal County, Arizona, about an hour south of Phoenix, farming families have watched their water vanish. The Central Arizona Project Canal carries Colorado River water across 336 miles of open desert to reach central and southern Arizona. It is one of the most costly water systems ever built, a concrete river running through cactus and sand. When the federal government declared a shortage in 2022, Pinal County's farmers were among the first to lose their water. They held some of the lowest-ranked water rights in the state. Fields that had grown cotton, alfalfa, and grain for decades went dry almost overnight. Hundreds of acres of cracked brown earth now visible from the air where green rows used to be. A farmer named Will Thillander told reporters he had dried out over 1,000 acres of what used to be working farmland. Some of these families had been farming the same land for generations. Now they watched their water rights turn into paper promises that the river could no longer back up. The Akchin Indian community, a tribal nation in Pinal County that has depended on watered farming for centuries, saw their water cut as well. For a community that spent decades fighting in courts and in Congress just to lock in their water rights, watching those rights dry up in a shortage they did not cause carries a weight that goes far beyond farm money. It is a broken promise stacked on top of a very long history of broken promises. And then there is what the dropping lake itself showed. As the water pulled back across the lake bed at Lake Mead, it uncovered things that had been hidden under the surface for decades. In May of 2022, a barrel holding human remains was found at Hemingway Harbor, rusted, eaten away, and stuck in the mud. Then more remains were found nearby. Detectives believe at least some of the bodies date to the 1970s or 1980s. The clothing on one victim matched that time period. These were likely murder victims, dumped in the lake when the water was high enough to hide them. Their proof sat on the bottom for half a century until the drought pulled the water away. Around the same time, a World War II-era Higgins landing craft rose from the mud near the Overton arm of the lake. The same type of flat-bottomed boat used by American soldiers in the D-Day landing at Normandy. This one had been used for survey work on the lake in the 1940s and sank at some point, sitting on the bottom for nearly 80 years before the dropping water brought it back into daylight. Sunken boats, old dock posts, and stretches of the original canyon floor before the dam was built started showing up like pieces of a drowned world slowly rising back to the surface. Each find was a headline, but each headline was really saying the same thing. The water is far lower than it has ever been, and it keeps showing what it used to hide. But even all of this, the power loss, the intake crisis, the empty farms, the bodies in the barrels, is only the local picture. The wider picture is where the real alarm sits. Lake Powell, the second biggest man-made lake in the country, sits about 300 miles upstream of Lake Mead on the Utah-Arizona border. It holds back the Colorado River behind Glen Canyon Dam, and it has been following the exact same downward path as Lake Mead. Down, down, down. In 2022, Lake Powell dropped so low that the Bureau of Reclamation made emergency water releases from Flaming Gorge in Wyoming, more than 400 miles upstream, just to keep enough water behind Glen Canyon Dam to stop it from hitting its own minimum power level. The two biggest man-made lakes in America were both in crisis at the same time, and the federal government was basically moving water from one sinking ship to another. Now zoom out one more step. Because the Colorado River does not just water lawns in Las Vegas and fill pools in Scottsdale. It feeds a food chain that touches every state in the country. Southern California's Imperial Valley sits in the Sonoran Desert, just north of the Mexican border. It gets almost zero rain, but it uses Colorado River water to feed roughly 700,000 acres of farmland. And that farmland grows about 2/3 of America's winter vegetables. The lettuce in your salad in January, the broccoli on your plate in February, the carrots in your grocery bag in March. Much of it comes from the Imperial Valley, grown in desert dirt with Colorado River water. If water to the Imperial Valley gets a big cut, you do not just lose California farmland. You lose vegetables from grocery stores in Ohio, Georgia, and Maine. A water crisis in the desert Southwest turns into a food price crisis on the East Coast. This is a countrywide weak spot dressed up as a local water fight. And there is one more seat at the table that most Americans forget about. Mexico has a treaty promise of 1.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water per year. That treaty was signed in 1944. It is a deal between two countries. So even as the 7 American states fight over a shrinking supply, there is another nation with a legal claim that cannot just be thrown out. This brings us to the deadline coming fast. The current rules that control how Colorado River water gets split during shortages run out in 2026. When they expire, the 7 states and the federal government must work out new rules. And that fight is shaping up to be one of the hardest water battles in American history. The upper states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, want to guard their share. They argue, with some good reason, that they have not yet fully used their piece of the river. They have water rights on paper that they have never fully tapped. And they do not want to be punished because the lower states, especially California, have been overusing for decades. The lower states see it differently. California, Arizona, and Nevada hold the big cities, the big farms, and the political weight. California alone uses more Colorado River water than any other single state. Arizona has already taken huge cuts in recent years. Nevada has spent billions on saving water, recycling nearly every drop of indoor wastewater back into the system. Each state has a fair point, but the river does not care about arguments. It carries 12 to 13 million acre-feet in a normal year. The states are legally owed 16.5 million. No new deal changes the amount of snow that falls in the Rockies. No agreement makes the river carry more water than it can. And here's a fact that shows the craziness of the whole thing better than any number. The Colorado River, the river that carved the Grand Canyon over 6 million years, no longer reaches the ocean. For most of the last 25 years, the river dries up in the Sonoran Desert, somewhere south of the border, miles and miles before it would reach the Sea of Cortez. The river mouth that once spread across nearly 2 million acres of wetland, home to jaguars, cottonwood forests, and native fishing towns, is now mostly dry mud, cracked earth, and salt flats. The Cocopah people, whose name means river people, fished and farmed the river mouth for centuries. Today, the river that shaped their whole way of life barely trickles into their land. In 2014, the United States and Mexico worked together on a short, planned pulse flow that sent water down the dry riverbed for a few weeks. It was a gesture. The river briefly touched the sea for the first time in years. Then the water was shut off, and the river mouth went dry again. A river strong enough to carve a canyon a mile deep and 277 miles long cannot finish its own trip to the sea. That should tell you everything about how far the math has drifted from what is real. So, where does this leave Hoover Dam? The dam itself will stand for centuries. It is 5 million cubic yards of concrete locked into the volcanic rock of Black Canyon. Engineers built it to outlast the country that made it. It is not going anywhere. But a dam without water behind it is a landmark, not something people depend on. And right now, Lake Mead sits roughly 140 feet below where it was built to run. The power output is weaker. The intakes have been rebuilt. The farms downstream are running on less water. The river no longer reaches the sea, and every year, more water leaves the system than enters it. A few good winters can slow the drop, but they cannot undo a gap that has been growing since 1922. The 25 million people who depend on this water are not waiting for rain. They are waiting for 7 state governments to agree on who gets less. And so far, in over 100 years of trying, no one has stepped up first. Pat Mulroy, the woman who built the third straw, said it plainly in a talk years ago. The question was never whether the Colorado River would run short. The question was always when, and whether anyone would act before it was too late. The river is still flowing, the dam is still standing, but Lake Mead sits 140 feet below full, and the white ring on the canyon walls keeps climbing, 1 foot at a time, closer to 895.